This ZeroNow program is brought to you with the support of our founding partners.
I'm just one person.
Determined
to bring us back to zero.
I'm just one person.
Determined
to bring us back to zero.
I am just one person.
Determined to bring us back to zero.
How about we talk a little bit about how you got involved in public safety and the security sectors?
Sure. I've had an entire career that wasn't planned this way, but an entire career that's been, the main theme has been education and safety and fairness. And it goes back to originally wanting to be a teacher when I was at Penn State as a freshman. Realizing that wasn't the path, I wanted to work directly with at-risk youth and help those families in their communities. Eventually led to an internship at a small nonprofit. From there, I got to learn what it meant to, help some of the most at-risk youth across a county. And it was through that experience that my eyes were open, right, to a different perspective, which is a lot of what college is about. It's a great internship. Eventually, they hired me. I stayed there for 13 years, left as a senior executive. We went from one small county agency serving children and families to 3 states. And it's through that experience I was able to become a nonprofit executive. But then with that education, social services, workforce development background, and safety of communities through the juvenile justice system, I was able to transfer that as executive director of CLERY Center. And if you've heard of CLERY Center, most students hopefully are now aware of or should be aware, and their families, of the Jean Cleary Act. And that protects tens of millions of students and also visitors and any other stakeholders in a campus community every single day, even through pandemic. It's crime reporting, but also the practices and policies that are necessary to support an institution-wide culture of safety on campus and beyond. And so that was an experience shortly after the Virginia Tech tragedy, where I was fortunate enough to have some really good mentors and people much smarter than me, have the Clearys take me under their wing as well, and Mrs. Cleary. And, they showed me how complex federal public policy can actually, when it's fine-tuned properly, can make a really big difference in the lives of everyday people, each individual. And it was through that time we worked on CLERY Act amendments for emergency notification. That was obviously in the wake of Virginia Tech and other shooting tragedies. But there was also a tragedy at University of Virginia dealing with intimate partner violence. So eventually we developed the Campus Save Act, which was rolled into the Violence Against Women Act and later reauthorization. We also were able to further refine CLERY to include hate and bias crimes reportings on campuses nationwide. So it's those type of efforts that we continue to build upon, and CLERY Center has gone even further. Now a lot of efforts in hazing and other initiatives. But that's the framework in public policy and in nonprofit service that I really was able to find my passion. It all came together as executive director. And so I took a journey, a couple other jobs, went to the private sector, helped build a national consulting firm. And it's still, I consider, one of the best in the country today, dealing with K-12 and higher education, campus safety issues and policies. And also from there, eventually went then to a major corporation and was director of higher education for hundreds of campuses nationwide. Really thought leadership and subject matter expertise focused on community-oriented campus public safety. And so that's what brings us to today. I eventually went to co-found a company using technology to apply that to the CLERY Act and also to Title IX issues. And through that time, I ran for public office in Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia. And I serve as an elected volunteer, which means the only unpaid politician in Pennsylvania as a school board director. And I'm now in my 4th year of a 4-year term. And I chair the Safe Schools Committee and the Facilities and Operations Committee of the 6th largest school district in Pennsylvania. So I've been very fortunate to have these experiences, and along the way, serve on other nonprofits whose missions really resonate with me. County Network of Victim Assistance. There's a Protect Students Abroad, and now I'm very happy to be on the advisory board of ZeroNow. So, as always, I could be surrounded by smarter people, learn some really interesting things, and help advance the mission of ZeroNow, and especially the goals of students who want to get to zero.
Absolutely. So it sounds like your focus has been on campus safety and improving the safety of campuses, school campuses, and our communities, which, of course, is the mission of ZeroNow as well. So what, in your view, is the problem, and what does the solution look like? What are some next steps that we need to be taking to solve that problem?
Well, the problem is peeling the onion, right? But the solution is also multi-layered. And so what we want to, as a society, be able to address, I think one of the number one issues is responsiveness. And the flip side of that is communication. So if we're not able to listen to one another, we're not going to be able to hear different perspectives and diverse opinions. Means we're also going to ignore communities that are marginalized or who don't have the access to communicate and attain a response, maybe from those in leadership. So I look at it from the top down. You really have to be attuned culturally, right, societally, to what the needs are of your stakeholders in any community. And when you apply that to a school environment or higher education, to a college or university campus, what is important to supporting that culture of safety is that when people feel they can communicate what their concerns are or their issues, and that they're listened to, there's a feedback loop which is going to occur across an institution. And it goes across the silos. It's not just campus public safety. It's not just student affairs. It's not just one office somewhere in the bottom of a basement at the end of a hallway. But when an institution is able to support those type of efforts, communication is going to increase. It's like increasing the antennas that are up, right? All of a sudden, you're going to receive more information. Then what you need to do is act upon it. And so that's one of the things I learned early on at the CLERY Center. And I got my master's in public administration from Villanova. So I love political science. I look at things structurally. So it's one thing to listen. It's another thing to respond. But most importantly, your budget states your priorities. And so do the institutions that students attend, that families pay their money to and entrust the lives of their loved ones, what does that budget tell us about their priorities? You can listen, you may be responsive, but are you properly resourced? And that's key, because my last point about this overarching strategy, what are we doing to be proactive? Reactive is when we waste money. Reactive is too late. Proactive and holistic is when we're able to increase communication, have that responsive feedback loop, identify where the resources should be, and that's going to create a more cohesive culture of safety, keep a vibrant learning environment, embraces the diversity of everybody who is part of that campus community, and supports, one of the really strong pieces of research that has come out over the years, and this is the Department of Education and the U.S. Secret Service. It sounds like common sense, but it all hinges upon, and they identified that where people in schools feel that they can communicate and will be listened to, disasters and tragedies are averted. And the converse of that, of course, is that when the communication doesn't exist and students and stakeholders feel that they can't communicate and won't be responded to, well, then risks are increased. And so what are we doing to make sure that we're on the positive, proactive side of that formula?
Right. So it sounds like that the community-oriented public safety approach is actually a tool that can be used to stop these tragedies before they even happen. So that's really interesting to me. And I think what I'm curious about is, what are the ways that you go about and your team go about changing the culture inside these institutions to reprioritize a community-based approach?
There have to be honest conversations, right? And This is also a multimodal approach. Technology can be used to accelerate that feedback loop and the conversations going back and forth. We always have to be aware at the same time that that could also create an obstacle. Technology can create so much information that we aren't able to go through it, and we miss key aspects of communication. We don't attain our goals. But leadership is where it all begins, from the top down. You want to make sure that at your institution, it's not just talk. What are the actions that are in place? What is sustainable and resonates across an entire year? Not just orientation and, a pizza and some soda to talk about crime prevention. What is an institution investing in, not just to make sure that their community is safer, but how are they then listening to those stakeholders and community members, the students, to ensure that, once again, it's not just a couple times a year that you talk about safety, but we're here to listen. Beyond safety, it's not just talking about make sure you don't prop a door open and other type of very important lessons that many of us hear across our education continuum. But what's just as important about that community-oriented approach is how are we actually connecting with one another? It has nothing to do with policing, law enforcement, security, or overall campus public safety. Are we there for one another to listen? Are we there at the times when people are having fun and not just in distress, right? Do we understand that, is campus public safety out and about walking and on bikes? Or do we have officers just sitting in cars detached? Now, that's one very simple example, but that reflects what the overall culture and direction may be. So, when I was a director at this one national company, we had campuses across the country to provide contract campus public safety officers. Many times we would be brought in to change that culture, to be more community oriented. And what you want to look at strategically, one of the first red flags is, how does your campus public safety office interact with students? And you could take that same exact approach to all other aspects of your institution, student affairs, the women's center, the library. If we have a culture in which people are divided, not talking across those different social groups, well, then we're probably going to create opportunities in which threats that could be averted might actually be missed because people are too focused on just their one thing and their one function of what they do. So it ultimately comes down to not having a rigid strategy, but one that's able to adapt. And that's where I find the technology and the outreach can be really helpful. Climate surveys annually are very important. And I think we're going to see year after year, more and more institutions that are using that approach to understand where their blind spots may or may not be. I would put that out as a positive. If your institution is using a climate survey and communicating its results effectively with their entire population and receiving feedback, well, then you probably have a more responsive institution than those who may not want to find out their blind spots. They might want to just keep their head in the sand. And that's an old 20th century model, which does not decrease risk.
There are red flags that exist across school districts, and the more districts that you go and you look at and you seek to change, the more it sounds like that you realize the problems that exist are not individual to one school. They exist across many schools, and we need to change the entire culture of education. So what do you think about that? What are some examples of red flags that exist throughout the entire education system that your team has worked to change?
Well, whether I'm an elected school board official or I'm working in for K-12, or I'm in a capacity advising an institution about their culture of safety and some of the changes they might need to make to their programs to have a more community-oriented focus. One of the things we'll always look at is, I've mentioned before, reactive versus proactive. There's that security theater which just makes us feel better, but does not have a good return on investment, right? By the time an active shooter arrives or any type of traumatic event at one of our schools or campuses, it's already too late. That's great. You might have bulletproof glass and metal detectors, but we've already failed if that threat is showing up. And that's why behavioral threat assessment, that's an evidence-based, methodical approach, which can make a real difference. If your school district or your institution does not have a behavioral threat assessment team that meets regularly and is also being trained regularly on the constantly evolving standards and research, then you may be at a higher risk for other problems systemically because you're not looking on the radar as to the threats which are occurring inside your school or campus environment, but also outside of it that may visit as tragedy.
So I think what you're getting at here is this illusion of safety. You hear, school administrators talking about how public safety is important to them. They buy a bunch of metal detectors and install bulletproof glass. But then when you look at their budget and you really examine their priorities on a systemic level, you realize that they are not paying any attention to the root causes that are negatively impacting campus safety. And just like you said, that bulletproof glass and that metal detector, those things are only useful once the threat has arrived, but they don't do anything in stopping the threat in the first place. So yeah, I think it's really important that we recommit to examining the root issues and making sure that these things do not happen instead of preparing for when they do.
I like how you present that because, what's the focus on the social emotional learning? This is like balancing a checkbook, or the worst case scenario, if we don't get it right in the beginning in those earlier grades, then it's going to continue to have permutations that deviate from what the ultimate goal is, right? For that individual, for their family, for the community to be safer, it's going to be a lot more cost effective and beneficial if we deal with that sooner. Whether that issue arises in first grade, seventh grade, or it might be in a freshman year when someone goes off to school. But that's why you need a unified approach across that continuum. What I mean by unified approach is the adaptability to be nimble and to look at evidence-based practices, promising practices which are emerging, and we apply that in these learning environments. Most students in most schools, supermajority across America, are very safe, right? There are more shootings which happen in restaurants every day. Let's keep that very clear, or at least pre-pandemic, right? And shut down. We have to realize that schools generally are quite safe. And that's a generalization. And we know, unfortunately, from the news every day that doesn't end up being the case. There are great proactive approaches and strategies, which we've touched upon some of those strategies and tactics today. And I don't want to overlook the good work that's being done. But what we can do is make ourselves better educated, more aware of what does work. And to your point, and what some of your questions are helping to elicit, what are some red flags or maybe some vestiges of a 20th century approach, which really isn't serving us to this day? Might make us feel better, but is it really helping to provide for a more thorough culture of safety on our campuses and in our schools?
Do you see this community-oriented model extending beyond the classroom? Because like you said, schools comparatively are a safe place, but that doesn't mean that public safety isn't a huge problem in other areas that impact students. So how do you see this community-oriented model working in places beyond the classroom and beyond systems of education?
I really see that for the same reason we can assign blame and say that schools are expected to do too much, right, to help with society's ills. We can also change the polarity and say that our schools, whether they're higher education or K-12, they represent a multi-systemic aspect of society. And in some ways, it's a litmus test as to whether we're really succeeding or not. Or are we instead accelerating inequities across systems to the schools which have and those which have not? And I know in Pennsylvania, you could just drive to the next school district and you can see that type of inequity, and then drive to the next and the next. And it goes beyond than just the school to how schools are funded. That comes down to how they can meet their priorities, and then schools ultimately are pulling in those elements, whether it's domestic and intimate partner violence that is occurring outside of the school, but that impacts students negatively with childhood trauma. Those are the type of aspects that ultimately schools are having to respond to. What's going on at home or what's going on outside of the home, but also outside of the school, which then visits upon our school community. Everything from opioid addiction, drug and alcohol issues, gun violence in particular, which is obviously one of the focuses that we have, to even sexual assault, K-12 through higher education. These are all society problems that just come to visit in school environments. What we can do in those school environments, though, is at least take our head out of the sand, look in the mirror, admit that we have inequities, that we do have some issues which need to be addressed, but let's also be positive. There are programs and practices and investments that we can make that can actually change the direction. Sometimes it's a bit more out of our hands, and you might need the state house to supply a lot more money to the schools to change that around. But you can also look at very local levels. And just by having students and families with a better awareness about what a good safety program looks like, that means they can hold accountable those people who are in charge. And ultimately, what this comes down to, I mentioned my background with the CLERY Act. Just imagine in a K-12 community, if that administration and the school board is held accountable because they must report accurately incidents which are occurring on that school property. If they're held accountable for that, they also are communicating it so that their stakeholders in the community are aware. Think about what kind of a discussion you can have when you actually know the accurate statistics and they're communicated regularly. That's going to drive accountability. It's going to make change in our schools. That doesn't cost any money, right? That's the power to vote, the power to make change. And in many ways, I think what ZeroNow is able to do is amplify that type of approach. We want better information. Right. We want better communication, and that will create accountability.
And I think that's one of the great things about ZeroNow is that it isn't something that will cost money, because like the point that you were making before, one of the obstacles that I'm sure you've run into are districts that don't have a lot of money in their budget, or districts in inner cities that are dealing with a whole host of problems that a district in an affluent suburban neighborhood doesn't need to think about and doesn't need to deal with. So talking about something like statistics and having accurate, informed, community-oriented conversations isn't something that costs money. It's something that any district can do, that district in the affluent suburban neighborhood and that district in the inner city.
Yeah, and that's where I believe it's an approach that works for everyone. Each school or community is going to have its own set of issues and therefore priorities that they must set. But, I think one of the examples we've seen in higher education that with the pandemic has only been magnified, food insecurity. Now, we might think that has nothing to do with community-oriented public safety and security issues. But are we understanding of our populations, what percentage are food insecure? A recent study said in some areas it's up to 50% of the students in higher education. What does that do for a stressor for somebody? Then we look at other mental health, economic issues, marginalized populations. If we don't address those variables, it's very difficult then to create that overarching culture of safety, because we're turning a blind eye to those factors, which may unfortunately, for some individuals, you check one too many boxes, right? That's when tragedy or someone is going to, commit to a bad act that we probably could have found a way to prevent if people had been communicating more responsive and sensitive to, the issues that might typically go by us on any given day.
And finally, how does ZeroNow dovetail with the work that you guys are doing? Why do you believe in ZeroNow, and why did you want to become a part of this community?
Well, I'm proud to be part of this community because ultimately it's the students who are going to lead us in America away from the division that we sense and feel today. And so to support student efforts and clear a path, it's not about me being a leader. It's making sure that the next generations of leaders are able to get there faster. We need it today. As far as the initiative of ZeroNow, it resonates with me. On my first day on the job, Mrs. CLERY sat me down, told me 3 clear things that she wanted to accomplish. The one thing that she made very clear to me, and I think this quote is still up on the CLERY Center webpage, and to paraphrase, it's that no education is worth it if any student is harmed. And I believe in that to this day. It's unacceptable. And we could even apply this to COVID, unfortunately. If we can prevent harm to a student, then we should do everything possible to make sure that that is the case. One death, one traumatic shooting or event that happens on the campus is one too many. The minute that we accept that, I'm not being an idealist. I'm being a realist. It should be 0 now. That is the only number that we should accept. And the minute that we don't accept that, we need to look ourselves in the eyes as Americans and question where our priorities for safety really lie.
100%. I couldn't agree more. Thank you so much, John. I think this was a great interview. I think we covered a lot of ground, and I think we touched on a lot of really important subjects.